Can a lover go but to the land of his beloved? And what seeker findeth rest away from his heart's desire?
Thank you very much. So we're still reading from Copper to Gold, the story of Dorothy Baker. So two things about Dorothy's life in the early 1940s stand out. What she achieved and how she went about it. The list of cities and towns where she spoke during these years dwarfs her previous travel teaching efforts. I mean, she did travel a lot. On average, the number and locale of her speaking engagements would suggest a talk every few days with miles of highway between. But the reality is even more overwhelming. Dorothy pressed her speaking engagements together into blocks of several weeks each, with much of the remaining time spent on administrative work. The local spiritual assembly of Lima, membership of the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada, activity on 6 nationally appointed committees, chairmanship of the National Child Training Committee, the Inter-America Committee, and the National Race Unity Committee, and membership on the Central State Summer School Committee, the Regional Teaching Committee for Ohio, Indiana, Western Pennsylvania, and the National Public Meetings Committee. Now, so you can imagine, I mean, I haven't seen anybody that has done so much travel teaching, lecturing, speaking, and chairing the National Assembly and sitting on about 6 national committees. Among her travel teaching trips were several devoted solely to college lectures. On one trip, Dorothy spoke at all the outstanding campuses in North and South Carolina and Southern Georgia, and many schools in West Virginia and Florida. Many colleges in Kentucky and Tennessee also received her. Sometimes these lectures were given under the auspices of the College Foundation Committee, later known as the Bahá'í College Speakers Bureau, which she was trying to help establish. Other times, as a representative of the Race Unity Committee. Among the subjects were achievements of minority groups, the cause and curse of prejudice, and sharing civilization, with many additional talks by Louis Gregory on topics including racial amity. In the fall of 1941, having received a letter from Shoki Effendi in August, encouraging her to do as much of this type of work as possible during the present year, Dorothy traveled to the Southwest, speaking at 27 schools throughout Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico, stopping in colleges in Arkansas and Iowa on her way. In New Mexico, Dorothy also visited the Isleta Pueblo with Mary Lou Ewing and met with its leaders. At 8 of the schools in the Southwest, the student body was made up entirely of minority students, 4 schools Indian, 4 others Black. In the first 2 years of the new decade, Dorothy visited and spoke at more than 90 college campuses, 90, adding a dozen more the next year. Through lectures given by Dorothy and other representatives of the NSA's committees, the second month of 1942 brought the local total number of college students who had heard of the faith to approximately 16,000. On July 31st, she received a cable, advise concentrate colleges fall, praying still greater victories, deepest love, being appreciation, Shoki Rabbani. By 1943, the College Speakers Bureau was fully formed and many more Baha'i volunteered to travel and lecture at schools across the country, At the end of the year, as Dorothy wrote in the Baha'i World, the total number of schools and colleges to receive Baha'i speakers is now over 200, and it is estimated that some 350 actual talks have been delivered before chapels, assemblies, classrooms, and student clubs. Until wartime gasoline rationing went into effect, Dorothy drove on most of her speaking tours, pressing the miles between campuses into whatever time she had, with the result that her driving wasn't the safest. Though many people have commented that Dorothy was a good driver, even when she was not in a hurry, she liked to drive fast, as you know, and with a certain amount of abandon. On a trip together a few years before, Mary Lou Ewing surprised Dorothy with a jittery response to her swinging ease in passing other cars and her high speed on hills, highways, and winding country roads. Initially, Dorothy's driving somewhat amused Mary Lou, but when they came into the hills of southern Ohio, she had trouble restraining herself even to sudden gasps and stiff-armed racing against the dashboard. After a particularly rousing lunge past the car in front, the downhill side of the road precariously closed, Dorothy put the Cadillac sedan into second gear and roared up the narrow, winding highway. Mary Lou, who had been in a state of paralyzed silence, thanked God for saving her on the one last time and finally spoke up. Dorothy, will you please drive more carefully? Please don't pass cars on hills. I'm not important to Baha'u'llah, but you are. So if you're going over the edge, you'll be saved, but I'll certainly be killed. Unconscious that her friend's fear had been sincere, Dorothy was both surprised and amused. She hadn't seriously thought of danger, but laughed and agreed to be more cautious. In the late fall of 1941, about to start out on one of her college trips, Dorothy asked Mary Lou to accompany her this time through the southern states. For various reasons, Mary Lou had to decline her friend's invitation to join her on this trip, but Dorothy persisted. Still, she couldn't accept the invitation even when Dorothy offered to pay her expenses. Though Mary Lou adored Dorothy and would have liked to spend more time together, she felt she had to return to New Mexico. I guess she was pioneering in Albuquerque. Even Dorothy's beguiling logic and obvious desire for her company couldn't sway her. Mary Lou could not believe it when 2 days later, on the way out of town, Dorothy stopped by again and said, "There's something wrong with this trip. I think it's that you are supposed to be with me. Put those clothes in the bag and come." Still firm, Mary Lou couldn't be convinced. There may be something wrong with the trip, but it's not that I'm supposed to be with you. So a day and a half later, Dorothy was driving through the Blue Ridge Mountains. Luckily, her lane of the mountain road had been warmed by sunlight and was free of ice, but the inner lane, closest to the mountain, looked precarious. As Dorothy rounded a curve and swung back toward the mountain to follow the road deeper into the late fall woods, a massive truck made the turn from the other direction. For a moment, it looked as if the truck were driving in her lane on the outside of the curve. It's a very difficult description, I guess. I hope you can follow this, but there's no good news in here. She flinched in horrified anticipation, then realized it must only be an illusion. But Dorothy's eyes wouldn't let her mind ignore the obvious. The flat nose of the truck was still coming and was not next to the mountain as it should have been. Instinct said to swerve, though her mind still fought for reality as it should be. For a flashing moment of imagined relief, Dorothy knew the catastrophic would be averted and the tension broken as quickly as she passed on the inside of the truck. She jerked her steering wheel left into the inner lane where the loaded flatbed should have been. Responding faster than her mind had obeyed her vision, the car, still moving at full speed, swung over. In her own rightful lane. The truck kept coming, its clattering roar blocking out every other sound and perception. Its double wheels and veering load filled her vision, then went barreling away down the mountain road. Disaster averted, but her car wheels unsure on the icy inner lane. Dorothy pulled the steering wheel on the right to get back on her own side of the road. The turn of the tires threw her car into a skid on the smooth, wet ice. The departing truck successfully avoided by forcing her to drive on the frozen section. The rumble of heavy wheels on asphalt was disappearing in the distance as Dorothy felt a new panic and struggled to keep her car from careening toward the cliff. Free of Dorothy's control, it twisted wildly to the right, a foreign body spinning her farther from the mountain toward the emptiness of open air. Options gone, Dorothy watched the high treetops coming close. Her mind slowed to the speed of wordless motion, but the car still spun in its frenzied circle, not yet ready to hurl itself into orbit. Now the wet, scaly mountainside faced her, melted snow making its rough facets glitter. The vitreous rock caught her staring gaze, coming toward her at the top speed as the treetops had the moment before. The car lunged toward the wall of rock as the front end made a futile, hurtling attempt to break through to the other side of the mountain. Dorothy's teeth sent a powerful vibration through mouth and skull as they collided with the steering wheel. Then she felt the car lift off its front wheels. It rolled completely over and landed again. Very bizarre. I mean, it's just an awful accident. The car just all over the place. She lay bleeding on the front seat and woke to feel detritus enamel scrambled on her tongue, matching the fragmentary falling of granular rock that dropped from the mountainside onto the wrinkled hood of the car. Dorothy touched her wet lips and found warm red blood on her fingers, right hand cupped under her mouth. She struggled to unlock the door, finally sitting in the car, feet on the ground outside, with bleeding face pushed beyond them to keep her fresh suit clean. A motorist pulled to a stop and ran toward her. Shaken and pale at the sight of the crushed car, the bloody woman slumped out of it. Dorothy looked up from where she let the rich, heavy blood drip and coagulate on the dark asphalt. He saw it too. She said, "Thank you for stopping. Can you please take me on to the next town? It's just over the hill and I'm due there this afternoon." "You can't travel. Why don't we just get you to my car and I'll take you back to the doctor?" The man reached for Dorothy's arm and supported her by the shoulders as they walked toward his car. "I think it's just my lip. If you could just take me along with you over the hill, I could wash up at the gas station. Your car is a total wreck and you're in no shape to go anywhere but the hospital." With no more discussion, the man put her in the back seat, turned his car around, and took Dorothy to the only doctor in the town she had just left 45 minutes before. Dazed but insistent, Dorothy tried again with her examining physician. "When you know I'm all right, I really must make arrangements to go on. There are people waiting for me." The doctor took her home number and called Frank. Ignoring her desire to carry on with her speaking tour, they made arrangements for her to get back to Ohio and for the car to be towed home. When Mary Lou stepped into her room in Lima, Dorothy said, "See, I've come back to get you." Mary Lou was shocked. She said, "You're not going out again. This trip really may be wrong." Dorothy's answer was, "No, if I weren't supposed to finish the trip, I would have been killed." The next week, Dorothy did go on with her scheduled tour, this time in Frank's car, as hers was irreparably damaged. At the following National Special Assembly meeting, some of the members were talking with Dorothy about why the wreck might have happened, guessing at reasons why Providence would have had it occur. Dorothy was considering the possibilities too. Only Louis Gregory was sat quietly listening. He watched them all muse over the spiritual significance of her accident. Dorothy, she blinked, pulled herself out of her thoughts, and looked up at Louis. You were driving simply too fast. As he had at Greenacre, he saw that Dorothy's mind was wandering to vain imaginings and said just the words to pull her away from them. The flavor of those college trips was adventurous even when Dorothy wasn't spinning her car into a mountain. After catching a ride with her, an older, dilapidated-looking hitchhiker told Dorothy as he got out of the car, "When you picked me up, I was going to do whatever it took to steal your money and your jewelry, but something stopped me." Before taking his splay-fingered hand from the door, the man leaned back in so his face, cross-hatched with a life of contradicting lines, came close to her, and his crackled lips again breathed the same air. "Whatever else you do driving around these hills, don't you ever pick up anybody that looks like me again. You hear? Never." He slammed the door and headed down the road. In Kansas, a tornado threatening storm threw Dorothy's car back and forth across the road. The countryside was empty and no other car traveled the deserted highway. Sighting a farmhouse, Dorothy stopped and tried to open her door, but the wind blew it again too hard. On the downwind side, she was able to push the car door open and slide to the ground. Sharp granules of blowing dust ripped into her eyes and hair and burned her skin as she crawled to the door of the house and banged on it with her fist. There was no answer. She tried the handle, but the door was bolted. Still lying on her stomach, Dorothy banged again with all her strength on the bottom of the door, hoping the people inside simply hadn't heard over the roar of wind and the battering sound of flowing debris as it slammed against the wooden walls. Then there were voices. Dorothy shouted back so they would know it was a human knocking there, not just the splintering wood with a wildly dancing porch swing pounding against the shuttered windows. "I'm outside, out here." A high-pitched voice, muffled by the closed door, tried to scream over the wind. "Can't open it." "I'm not dangerous. I just need shelter." "Got to keep the door closed. The pressure change would blow the place up." Dorothy lay there for a long moment, trying to find the reason or energy that could dispute that logic. A rock the size of a bar of soap bounced across the porch, tossed by the wind as if by a rolling mass of water. It hit her ankle bone, cutting her bare skin, exposed save for the ruined pair of stockings, a pair she had been saving through the shortages, especially for this speaking trip. Lying there, being blown and battered, seemed ridiculous. Though the other option was no more tempting, she made her way back across the yard and climbed into the front seat, unsure whether to go or to stay. Dorothy again chose to keep moving, this time in the hope of escaping the tempest. Slowly, she rolled down the road, furiously pulling the wheel one way, then the other, to keep the barely moving machine on the pavement and repeating out loud with every breath, "Ya Baha'u'llah." Other episodes were just as exhilarating, though with less physical drama. As Dorothy left an interview with George Washington Carver, the renowned agricultural researcher, he called out to her, "Tell the world, Mrs. Baker, that Dr. Carver is very partial to the Baha'i faith, very partial." With most of the Pacific Fleet destroyed by Japanese bombers and America thoroughly entrenched in a war effort, peace was a most unpopular subject. In an article on the activities of the College Speakers Bureau, Dorothy wrote, "At one college in North Carolina, the president sympathetically prepared the speaker for a bleak reception. My students," he remarked, "all but stopped the last speaker who mentioned peace, and he is a minister wearing the cloth, mind you." Looking carefully at a later time through the pattern of our future society, he said, "Oh, but I understand. You Baha'is do not dwell on pacifism. You offer a program. Every college should hear this. In this manner, school men seem almost invariably to accept the writings of Shawki Effendi, the talented head of the Indian Normal College at Pembroke, where no speaking appointment had previously been made, said after scanning the pattern that if necessary, classes could be disbanded to hear this subject. So, en route between colleges, Dorothy would sometimes put a can of soup next to the radiator to warm, then stop by the side of the road to eat her fast, inexpensive lunch. When time allowed, she would take advantage of a municipal golf course. Using the adjustable head club Frank gave her, she would play a few holes until she felt, as she put it, stretched out and could go on refreshed. Back from an early college trip, Dorothy dreamed that she saw hundreds of the students riding in square, bug-like open cars. The young people, all male, this is in a dream. The young people, all male, which seemed odd to her, called to Dorothy to join them in their destination. She recognized some of their faces as students she had spoken to at different colleges and universities, so she followed. The next impression was of being in a huge, luminous banquet hall, a long room with tables stretched its length on both sides. The young men were already seated, stretched its length on both sides. The young men were already seated when she arrived, lining the tables from the entrance of the brilliantly lit room to the far end, which seemed to disappear into light. When she entered, they were engaged in some joyous celebration, talking and laughing. But as she walked in, they all stood to greet her. The joy of the room filled Dorothy's heart as she walked between the tables of radiant young men. The next December, Pearl Harbor was bombed and the United States entered the war. Soon after, Dorothy saw her first army jeep and commented to the family that it was exactly like the car she had seen in her dream. Then a heavy bolt of understanding jarred her. The young men riding through her dream were on their way to meet death in those bug-like army jeeps, and the banquet where they would greet her was one they were going to soon in the next world. Travel talks, hundreds during the early 40s, even beyond those given at colleges. Counseling the Baha'is and near believers, these were the activities Dorothy gave herself to, but her friends and family members were never long forgotten, nor did they receive less than a full measure of her love, though her time was limited. The responses to her and the memories of her speak lucidly of Dorothy and of her devotion to her beliefs, which expanded her love to the people around her. Written accounts of these memories and her own letters during those same years, primarily in the early 1940s, display clearly her personality, her attitudes, and aims. So let's just read a little bit some of these comments from people that get close to her. This is Louise Mathias, her daughter. See, there is nothing I would love more than to give, she's quoting Dorothy Baker. She said, there's nothing I would love more than to give every minute of my life and all my attention, all of my acts to teaching work. But then I would become a very unbalanced person and I would not be able to give a true picture of the Baha'i faith. I have always to see to it that I have three facets in my life: my Baha'i work, my family, and my recreation. We're talking about her golf here. Mary Lou Ewing said, on the cross-country train ride with Dorothy from Ohio to New Mexico, she talked to me about how exciting it was to be alive. If she had her choice, she said she would have lived in the time of the Baha. She turned to me, her eyes alive with fire and excitement, and asked, Mary Lou, Wouldn't you have loved to be alive during the time of the Bab? I answered, good heavens, no. She looked so startled, but I was very serious and explained that I simply would not have had the spiritual wherewithal to have purchased or somehow gained that kind of privilege. I told her that I might want to buy a Cadillac, but would probably be lucky to get a Ford. To live among the dawnbreakers would have been like not having the wherewithal to join that august company. Dorothy obviously would have been part of them. One day she told me that I must face the fact that I must make the choice between being a mediocre Baha'i and being a flame-like Baha'i who truly serves. It was frightening. But I remember that she would put in very squarely on a person that the choice was essentially with that person as to what he would accomplish. Margaret Roof said, during the years that David and I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, on 2 different occasions, Dorothy came to be with us, and we felt honored, so honored that she took time out. One time, she came under conditions that really made me quite sad. I wrote and asked her if she could come and help us with the Weekend Teaching Institute. She wrote back and said that all her weekends were taken. There were no free gaps at all in the near future, but she said, you know, I have promised Frank and the children to go on a fishing trip with them to Norris Dam Lake in Tennessee. You know, that area is not that far from Atlanta. I just take a day and a half off and come down and be with you and then scoot right back up there to my family. This made me feel very bad because I felt that Frank and the children needed her so much, and I knew there were times when her family were very lonely. I knew that her family life had been somewhat disrupted and that the 2 children, Bill and Louise, missed their mother very much. Later on, I heard stories about how Bill really at times was very, very lonely in his childhood because his mother had to be so much away. Anyway, Dorothy came and spent the weekend with us. It was very interesting. We held a big public meeting. One of the evenings, she was there in one of the large hotels in downtown Atlanta. I had been asked to be her chairman. Dorothy arrived at the meeting wearing a beautiful long evening gown, and I was also wearing a long formal dress for evening wear. The 2 of us stood there receiving the guest, and the gentleman who became one of our very good contacts and studied the faith for many years, came in and sat down and looked around. After looking at Dorothy and me for a while, he came up and said, what do you 2 glamour girls know about religion anyway? Dorothy and I were simply delighted. We laughed and laughed, and I've never forgotten that remark. She was so human, and she enjoyed all the human touches. She always studied the hats I wore and always had some comment on them, and this tickled me to death. She was also very human in her domestic pursuits. For some reason or other, she did a special thing about canning fruits and vegetables. On her way home from convention, she used to stop at all those marvelous fruit stands in Illinois and Ohio and arrive home absolutely loaded with fresh fruit and vegetables. Then everybody in sight had to help with the canning process, which she thoroughly enjoyed. She got right into the middle of it herself. Now, this is from, there was Margaret Roof. I think was the wife of Dr. David Roof. Mary Lou Ewing said, another thing I remember about those early days was the ride to Bluffton, Ohio, 15 or 20 miles from town. Dorothy had called and asked if I would ride over with her to pick up Louise from a swimming party she had arranged for her. Going over, Dorothy commented on how she had been protected by Baha'u'llah in her mothering. She said that she realized she was away from her children a great deal, that it would have been very easy to have an estrangement, to have had a sense of neglect of her parental duties, a sense of separation and deprivation, but she had been comforted over and over again by being intuitively aware, even though absent from them, of difficult times which either Louise or Bill might be experiencing. She could be in the middle of a meeting, she could be in the middle of a trip, in the middle of prayers or studying, or most anything, and one of her children would come in to her mind in such a way that as to alert her that she should instantly turn to Baha'u'llah and ask for their protection. Later on, when she returned home, she would ask about what had happened, and over she would be able to tie the prayer or the sense of urgency for prayer to a crisis that had occurred in their lives. It was something that was on her mind and about which she was intensely grateful to Baha'u'llah for being close in this parent-daughter relationship or parent-son relationship. From her daughter when she was a teenager, she said, one time when mother was away from home at a teaching trip, I don't know if I read this to you or not. I woke early, feeling especially happy and loving. I dressed and ran down to the Pullman where Dad had already finished his breakfast and was looking through the newspaper. Hi, Dad, I greeted him happily and kissed the top of his head where his hair had begun to get just a bit thin. As I slid onto the bench across the table from him, I reached for the pitcher of milk, bumped against the toaster, knocking it to the floor with a great clatter, doubly loud because I tried to catch it on the way down. It shattered a cup and saucer, clanged against a heavy wooden chair, ricocheted off the end of the bench, and finally subsided under the table. In a desperate attempt to halt its progress, I was under the table too, on hands and knees. Dad's nerves were vibrating, and she snarled, for heaven's sake, Louise, can't you be more careful? My nerves were in no better shape than my father's. I scrambled out from under the table, leaving the toaster in its temporary grave, and snarled back, no, I can't. I was born clumsy. So anyway, the story is that, they would get into this fight, and the mother just happened to see in a vision that her daughter was falling from somewhere, and she just called home and was able to catch both father and daughter on the phone, and by talking to them, made peace and everything was okay. That's how sensitive she was to. So anyway, so the comments, there was just so many of them from so many people, because obviously making this book, the author had to write to all these people. So if the time and effort Dorothy exerted for the faith between her 45th and 52nd birthday could be cut like a pie, one half would be North America activity and the other half would be travels abroad. Work on the home front in the US and Canada would have to be divided again into two equally substantial wedges, teaching and administration. Dorothy diligently carried her weight and more on committees and institutions of the Baha'i cause. But from the beginning, her real joy was teaching. Seeing doubt, frustrated anger, or phlegmatic calm dissolve as people were exposed to the revelation of Baha'u'llah. She spoke with great love and eloquence, but she took praise reluctantly. For her adulation had become a necessary byproduct of the goal, allowing people to hear the message of her Lord. Junie Catherine Faley Perrott recalled seeing Dorothy Baker angry only once at Lou Hallen. Dorothy felt the chairman made too much of her. She commented, no one is that good. You praise me too much because I go around and speak a lot. Frank is a better Baha'i than I because he does not go around talking. Lenore Burstein also noted Dorothy's very deep sense of humility. She once heard Dorothy remark, it should be Frank, not I, who stands in the limelight. For if it were not for Frank's support and understanding, I could not travel or teach at all. And speak she did, thanks to him and thanks to her own efforts for the glory of the Lord. 100 years after the Bab declared his mission, 100 years after he fulfilled the promise of the world's sacred books, Dorothy spoke at the house of worship in Wilmette. Usually Dorothy was careless about her own privacy, except for prayer. Just a few nights before her talk, Dorothy slipped into Emma Rice's hotel room, whispering through the dark to Emma, who was already in bed. May I come in with you? I hope you don't mind, but my daughter can't find the room, so I'm letting her share mine with Frank. Early the next morning, Dorothy disappeared into the bathroom saying, wait for me, and we'll go to breakfast together. Her ease at sharing Emma's quarters, her friendly suggestion of breakfast together made Emma, although she was already hungry, change her mind and sit down on the unmade bed for what she assumed would be the length of time required for a short shower. Half-hour later, she was beginning to feel a hollow grinding in her stomach as she dimly realized no sound of running water yet heard, that Dorothy must have gone into the bathroom for her prayers. Time in the clockless room dragged on as Emma waited. She wondered if a knock on the bathroom door would be appropriate or if she would simply leave a note and go down to breakfast. Just at the point of putting one plan or the other into action, the door swung open and Dorothy emerged, an aura of zeal and charged energy surrounding her. Shall we? Emma eagerly agreed they should. At the table, Dorothy neither concentrated on her meal nor not cherished a few comfortable moments with her friend. Emma noticed she ate nothing, really, because she was too busy greeting people, answering questions, and radiating joy and happiness about her. That was Dorothy. God bless her. The only time Dorothy kept strictly for herself were the hours spent in prayer, meditation, or study. And those periods were usually in the early morning when other activities didn't make demands. But on the afternoon of May 22nd, 1944, having asked to be released for the rest of the day from their duties at the convention, Dorothy avoided lunch with friends and retreated instead to her hotel room. She felt the most important talk of her life was to be given that night at the Baha'i House of Worship. The occasion was the centenary anniversary of the Declaration of the Bab. Before the program of readings took place at 9:40 p.m. under the Great Dome, a public meeting was to be held at the Foundation Hall, where she and two others would present the Baha'i faith. Dorothy felt it was vital for the success of her talk to prepare herself spiritually. With the dawn breakers on her lap, she sat quietly in the room. Frank, her devoted protector, stood watch in the hall during lunch and the afternoon break so that admiring, zealous friends, eager and importunate, could not present themselves at her door. To the urgent pleas for exception in one case or another, Frank was stoic and firm. No one saw or spoke to Dorothy. Mid-afternoon, Frank drove her to the beauty salon where Dorothy continued to read while having her hair washed and set, avoiding even the friendliest of frivolous chatter. She did not want anyone or anything to dim her heart and tried instead to strain every nerve to acquire inward and outward perfections. She did not want to chance diminishing the power of the spirit she prayed would flow through her that night. Back at the hotel, after a last check of the long white dinner gown bought for the occasion and the final decision on what jewelry to wear, Dorothy settled down for several hours of uninterrupted prayer, study, and supplication. For Louise Baker, newly arrived home from her pioneering post, the evening was distinctly memorable. Foundation Hall was overflowing. Those who came too late to find seats stood up to hear the words of the evening speakers. For the first time in public, address system was set up to carry even outside Foundation Hall, so all who gathered could hear. 3 individuals spoke. Horace Holly, the author of several books of poetry and prose, also at the time member of the NSA, Dr. Harry Overstreet, a well-known writer of the day, and Dorothy George Latimer. Dorothy. George Latimer, another member of the NSA, served as chairman of the convention and of the public meeting. He introduced Dorothy first. She rose from her chair like a tall white candle glowing at the front of the room. She moved toward the podium on that, the first night of the 2nd century of the Baha'i faith. Radiant with the power and majesty of the historic moment, Dorothy spoke. I quote, "Religion is progressive, rushing forward like a giant river from God to the ages, watering the arid centuries to produce flowering civilization. and holy lives. God speaks, and the merciless opposers of his truth are swept into the limbo of the forgotten, while out of the lives of the martyr revelators moves the age-old twofold process of the fall of an old order of things and the rise of a believing people, endowed with the power to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. Dorothy manifested the very power of which she spoke, the power that enables believers of God and his progressive plan for humankind to carry forward that potent, ever-advancing civilization. She spoke of the founders of the world's great religions, of their gifts of civilization. Foundation hall quivered with the shimmering vision Dorothy projected of God's kingdom finally come. She closed with these words: the religion of our fathers returns, opening a new chapter of revelation and revealing a newly ordered world, to which the prophetic welcome of the Bab calls all who are gathered in this commemorative place. Enter therein in peace, secure. The account in Baha'i News continues the description of the evening events. After the public meeting, we walked up the white path in the darkness, up the steps and through one of the 9 great portals. The vast space beneath the dome was packed with Baha'is. I wish the guardian could have been here to see them, to see all these holy souls across the earth who have grown out of the words that the Bab spoke in Shiraz 100 years ago tonight. Following the commemoration, Dorothy went to Emilia Collins' hotel, her eyes very bright, and whispered, "Get out of bed, Millie. We are praying all night." The joy must have filled the hearts of those 2 future hands of the cause, bowed down in adoration on the 100th anniversary of the dawn of their faith. The talk Dorothy gave that evening was published in World Order magazine under the title, "Religion Comes Again to Mankind," then as a pamphlet called Religion Returns. This was the second pamphlet written by Dorothy to be released in the mid-40s, following the one entitled The Victory of the Spirit. In July of 1944, Dorothy also spoke at a special centenary conference arranged by the National Spiritual Assembly for delegates from the 5 Latin American countries and who had been unable to attend the commemoration in May. National work teaching on other continents, the needs of communities in the United States, all of these concerns and the concomitant days and months of effort they demanded sometimes made Dorothy unsure which areas should receive her most concentrated attention. She even asked friends in Lima to please consider her situation when they elected the next local spiritual assembly, as she was a member of the NSA, the LSA of Lima, and numerous committees. Because of their concern for her well-being, she was not elected to the local spiritual assembly. Relieved but feeling guilty, she wrote to the Guardian for his opinion of her action. He wrote back that Dorothy should not have encouraged the friends not to vote for her. In Baha'i elections, individuals should feel free to vote for whomsoever they choose. The next Rizwan, Dorothy shared the guidance, but still aware of her multiple responsibilities, the Baha'is did not elect Dorothy to the Lima assembly. So the Guardian is against people saying to the Baha'is, "Don't vote for me." You're not supposed to say that. Very interesting. He just told her. The little towns were segregated, but the Baha'i faith reached across a racial divide. Mrs. Dake remembered Dorothy Baker speaking of Louis Gregory to the rural Baha'is of her area. Dorothy said that Louis Gregory was the only person she knew of who had been able to stay in the presence of Abdu'l-Baha for more than 20 minutes while a tablet was revealed to him. The rest fainted. The Baha'is of Hinckley and Granger decided it was time to teach their dark-skinned neighbors. Mrs. Dake arranged for Dorothy and Louis Gregory to speak before the Black congregation of the Second Baptist Church in Medina, Ohio. Mrs. Drake watched as Dorothy spoke so lovingly of Louis Gregory that tears came to the minister's eyes as she spoke of how Abdu'l-Baha placed him at the embassy table in Washington, D.C. In Lima, the faith kept moving forward in spite of the barrier of racism. The future Knight of Baha'u'llah, Elsia Austen, wrote, I first met Dorothy Baker when I was a young inquirer, reluctantly interested in the faith because of its newness and because I had reached the point of disbelief in the power of religion to change people or social circumstances. The bigotry and prejudice in the world seemed to me at that state to be served by religion rather than diminished. Mrs. Baker and Mr. Frank Baker lived in Lima, an insular reactionary small town in Ohio, a citadel of conservatism and an area once identified with activities of the Ku Klux Klan. In the rigid climate of the city, Frank and Dorothy Baker had opened their home for the Baha'i meetings, to which all persons were welcome. Dorothy's special radiance of spirit and eloquence in speech made her home the site for regional fireside to which believers and inquirers from cities and towns within a radius of 50 miles from Lima would come. Here the teachings were always earnestly and beautifully presented. This was the period of the early 30s when racism and bigotry were the accepted way of life, and people who did not suffer from this blight did not often have the courage or the convictions. Because of this atmosphere, the courage and stand for human unity which the Bakers took in opening their home to teach a new faith and to persons of many races and backgrounds was a traumatic thing for Lima. The comings and goings of so many different people attracted much attention, yet the Bakers were never apologetic or furtive in their efforts for the faith. Their courage and their sincerity gave real results, for nearly every person who went to those firesides became a dependable and predictable Baha'i. The July 1944 issue of Baha'i News shows Dorothy Baker in a photograph of 9 individuals, all dressed meticulously, the 2 men wearing suits, the women in corsages, pearls, or hats. These were the speakers at a race unity banquet held in Lima. 2 were African-American women, one of them Frances Cotman. More than 50 years later, her grandson, Dr. Ivan Louis Cotman, recalled. And I will read his testimonials. Charles, my grandfather, was a carpenter and a night watchman at the Frank Baker Bakery, which I often visited during my teen years when I was sent from Detroit to visit my grandparents in the summers. As I understand it, it was my grandfather who began to be interested in the Baha'i faith. Frances, my grandmother, was a domestic, Dr. and Mrs. Halfhill, there, a local physician. I can't recall her doing anything besides being a domestic until later when she started Cotman's That's for Cats Cat Hotel at 932 West High Street in 1947. Neither had finished high school, but when they passed away, I found books on Arabic. They had written Allahu Akbar and other Arabic words in the margin of the books. Imagine Negroes in the early 50s attempting to write and read Arabic. Very insightful. My grandmother was very active in diverse Baha'i activities, including traveling to Baha'i meetings in different cities. Apparently, my grandmother accompanied Dorothy Baker to Baha'i lecture at Kentucky State College, now Kentucky State University, located in Frankfort, Kentucky, the capital city. Kentucky State was then completely segregated. It was still segregated when I entered college in 1958. It is noteworthy that my grandmother accompanied Mrs. Baker to an integrated affair in a period when nothing was integrated, not even the bus station. I remember the bus station in Mount Sterling. My father said, you sit over here. This is where I have to live. Bobby Kennedy can tell you where you can sit, but I've got to live here. So while you are here, you sit on the Negro side. These were efforts, Mrs. Baker's efforts and my grandmother's at integration. I have memories of visiting Lima in the summer and going to the Baha'i Center at the home of Frank and Dorothy Baker about 1953-54. It was a two-story house where people met, brick. You went up the porch stairs, then there was a room on either side of the entry hall. As I recall, there were a number of blacks and whites at these prayer meetings, and this assemblage of people would pray together. It wasn't like Baptist chants, but there was a cadence. When I remember clearly, my grandmother's favorite, which I often quote, is in the removal of difficulties of God. That prayer is powerful. It's a legacy Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Cotman left to me and my generation. I recall fondly my teen experiences in Lima, including sunrise breakfast services, the Baha'is at Schoonover Park. On Sunday mornings, they'd go to the park and wait for their sun to rise. They'd have all this good food, the potluck, breakfast, picnic tables. My point is, there was an outdoor social interaction between blacks and whites in that very socially repressive town. Mrs. Baker and my grandmother were advanced in a very segregated, monolithic, repressive atmosphere, which I think says something about the Baha'i faith, not to mention the valor of Dorothy Baker. My grandfather told me about the Universal House of Justice before he died. In 1994, while serving as Deputy Superintendent of the Michigan Department of Education, I accompanied the delegation of staff from the United States House and Senate committees to Haifa, Israel, on Mount Carmel, high above the Mediterranean. One can look out and see all of Haifa. One's attention is automatically drawn to the golden dome of the Shrine of the Bab and the surrounding gardens. I found it very emotional to realize again these uneducated Negroes, as they were called, living in Lima, Ohio, of all places, would have an international perspective and the foresight to envision all that. I felt the Baha'i faith broaden my grandparents' perspective in a spiritual, literary, and geographical sense. My brother Charles and I were raised as Roman Catholics, and my mother's insistence. My mother had converted to Roman Catholicism from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church. Some of the family ostracized my grandparents. My mother would say things like, Mama Francis has gone crazy. He just didn't take time to understand what the Baha'i faith was about. But it made sense to us. As a Unitarian Universalist, the notion of progressive revelation of the harmony of sciences and religion, of racial harmony, these principles made sense to me. Just a word about my father. To the day he died, I never heard him talk about religion. I never knew what my father's religion was, but he always kept a picture of Abdu'l-Baha on his dresser. My brother and I were dropped off at church on Sundays, but he never went. I never saw him in church, but he would always pray using one of those Baha'i prayers. I still have that picture and his prayer book. And that's where we stop tonight. Yeah. Those were the days, 1940s. This is 8 years ago. That's the faith in America in those days. Okay, friends. Dorothy Baker. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. And we're not done yet. Dorothy's still with us. We have 14 more years to go through.